Captain, the UK government has sent 2 interceptors after us. They're hailing us now.
What's going on, midshipman? They have no jurisdiction over orbital space pubs.
I've got a stormtrooper on the line now, sir. He says the Online Safety Act now encompasses the vast infinitude of space. It's over.
There's nothing for it, midshipman. It's time to deploy our deadliest weapon.
Sir, you can't mean the Cummings interview.
I mean it, Mr. Drysdale. Initiate the broadcast.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon.
The highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
Dom, a key fact of the world as we see it right now is that the rules-based international order is crumbling. So there are many examples of this. Tariffs, the Iran war, perhaps even the furore over the Chagos Islands. What do you see in this respect?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the kind of the institutions built in the rubble of 1945, and as the Cold War was beginning, you have obviously UN, NATO, WTO, EEC as it was, the EU, etc., WHO, IMF, all these sorts of things. And they all seem really kind of played out and exhausted, right? They're in many ways just clearly incompetent. Their legitimacy, trust in them is imploded. COVID obviously undermined a lot of things. Brexit happens partly because the pro-EEC/EU forces lost the argument over a couple of decades about that. So yeah, you have what you often see in history, right? You see this sort of pattern in European history of every kind of like 50, 75 years or so. You have the international order of its time, the institutions and the ideas kind of gradually drift out of alignment with reality, and then you have crisis. So you can, I think it's interesting to think about the kind of mid-19th century. So if you go back to 1815, you have the end of one huge cycle, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. 1815, you have the Treaty of Vienna, and a set of new ideas about how the world will be organized, clear kind of great power concert, Metternich, Britain has a role in the system. You fast forward to the 1840s and you can see people all over Europe start to write letters, Metternich and Bismarck and Gerlach and all these people saying the old system's running out of rope. The young people are going crazy. There's all these new technologies. Then you've got telegraph and railway coming through, et cetera. You can sense that things are coming to a crunch, and then you have the 1848 revolutions, regime change, and then a new world arises out of it. And same thing essentially is happening now, right? It's a similar sort of thing. You've got 1815, 1945, set of new ideas and institutions. That generation has died out, gone, and the ideas and institutions that they left behind are clearly failing, and something new is being born. But for the moment, unclear exactly what.
I'm going to quote something which you have put many times at the end of your blog posts, which is technical changes such as genetic engineering and machine intelligence are bringing revolution. And then there's a Bismarck quote: "It would be better to undertake it than undergo it." So what I want to know is what is the world that you think we could be heading into maybe 30, 40 years from now? Are we talking a billion Chinese with 150 IQ? Are we talking American superintelligence organizing a vast space economy? Well, like what actually is at stake?
So even the people at the actual frontier in the AI labs will tell you that it's very hard to predict how the models are going to evolve in some ways, right? The various of those guys put straight lines on graphs a decade or so ago, and in all sorts of amazingly interesting ways, the straight lines on graphs have turned out to be true. Much derided by almost all of academia at the time.
Yeah.
Professors here, there, and everywhere laughed at these guys at the idea that scaling laws would be true, but in all sorts of ways they have been. But within that, they're very spiky, right? And as Dario and Sam and Demis will all say publicly, each time you do it, they spike up on that, but they're weirdly rubbish on blah. So there's no theory of it at the moment. It's just an empirical thing, and you find out as it comes out. But I guess one of my observations on it would be, I've watched this since 2020, and it is kind of amazing that the most optimistic, if that's the right word, or in any event, the people who predicted the most success for machine learning and the most dramatic changes and were most optimistic about the straight lines on graphs and the three labs, who were completely derided by the entire mainstream, have actually turned out to be the most accurate predictors of the future. That's extremely striking. And I think that at least for the next 2 years, right? So they release these models, but they have line of sight internally to at least, I would guess, roughly speaking, to like a year or two ahead, right, of what they can see privately before things are released. And as far as I can see, they're very confident that the straight lines on graphs will continue for at least another couple of years. Now, if you think of what that means in terms of the exponentials, that's very, 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 very dramatic. And I think for sure people in politics have not got their heads around it. We saw in COVID that exponentials are extremely hard. I experienced this myself, sitting there watching exponentials being real and watching the political class cope with it. And I don't think they've learned much. And you can see from the general mainstream discussion on AI, right? Even now, you head over to the blue sky world, and it's all still, it's a crypto scam, it's a bubble, it's bollocks. It's
going to use all the water.
It's going to use all the water. It's going to use all the water.
There's no way we can get it back.
Exactly. Kieran Martin, former senior official at GCHQ, Romaniac, just a few months ago, is tweeting away on Blue Sky, assuring all the Blue Sky NPCs that don't worry, it's just all plausible nonsense and hype. So the political world is doing what it's done repeatedly, which is just sort of deliberate blindness to the whole thing. You've also got, in parallel, you've got very rapid changes in biotech and the democratization of genetic engineering. And the two things are, in some sense, coming together, right? Because one of the other things that the models are improving at radically is all kinds of bio stuff. Demis proved it with AlphaFold and protein folding. But there's all kinds of other stuff now. And one of the, I think, most important things going on is the research inside the labs on how good these models are potentially at with bioweapons. And of course, we've just thinking about all the things we've already talked about. One of the amazing signs of the pathology of the system is that even after COVID, we are still allowing and funding gain of function. In America, the regulation of bio stuff is so appalling that they just keep finding these weird random Chinese labs full of Chinese people with all kinds of like completely crazy pathogens inside, just like some random thing with 50 people in LA, and no one knows like how the hell these things were set up. again, it's like a sort of weird sci-fi story that these things could exist. What are they doing? Who did it? No one knows. What are we doing as a civilization that's allowed? So if you think of, and of course also we haven't actually taken security seriously in supposedly the most secure biolabs, the BSL level 4 things. So that also remains a shit show. So you've got a bunch of things democratizing biological engineering. You've got the models improving on an exponential. You've got the models increasingly going to be plugged into the democratization process. And you've got completely crackers agencies in charge of regulating, surveilling, monitoring, all of that. And a bunch of public health people whose official story is that we all did a cracking job in COVID. So that's one, that's a whole set of things. Britain still has some great strengths in this area, right? It's still got huge talent. It's got a couple of great universities. It's got a great ecosystem in London and a few other places for some of these technologies. And to some extent has captured some of the flow west out of Europe. So all these young people leaving, mainly to California and Texas, but some have also stopped in London, and that's been to our advantage. By default, so almost all the positive things that we could have changed after Brexit, Westminster's Tories and Labour have been adamant in refusing to do anything. But just because of inertia, we haven't adopted various of the EU regulations, and therefore we haven't shot ourselves in both feet the way that Brussels has, which is good.
Well, it seems that the world is perhaps partitioning into blocks. So we have, the crinks, the US increasingly doing its own thing, and some might say that our place is with Europe. You might disagree.
So, yeah, I mean, there's so much you could say about that, right? But if you go back to the arguments that I made before the referendum, what were the fundamental arguments there? One set of arguments was about the weaknesses of Britain itself, that the actual regime in Britain is knackered and is failing, and the institutions are knackered, and they're not going to be able to cope with the world that's coming. That was an extremely niche view in 2015, extremely niche, regarded generally speaking as crazy. Now, of course, you can go on Twitter today and you can see the vast majority of Westminster is now kind of having to face up to this reality that the old parties are knackered, old Whitehall is knackered, the old media ecosystem is knackered, the universities lost huge credibility, et cetera, et cetera. So there's one set of arguments about Britain itself and British ideas and British institutions and the British ruling classes. Another set of arguments was about the state of Europe. So my argument was, if you look around, what do you see? You see a mix of stagnation, anti-technology, anti-growth, anti-future bureaucracy dedicated to Leninist bureaucratic centralism in Brussels. And everything will improve if everything is uniformly controlled by the Commission. But low growth, high debt, rising debt, nightmare pension systems, nightmare demographics, immigration out of control and fueling the rise of extremist parties. The argument that I made before the referendum was, if you look at what's happening technologically, increasingly it's China and California which are dominating and Europe is not in the game. Again, that was regarded as a very eccentric argument to make 10 years ago, but now it's an obvious, very mainstream thing. Okay, if you look at Britain's position now, we've obviously got huge problems, and in all sorts of ways, we have not done what the kind of vote leave plan was and what we started doing in 2019, 2020, because the Tories stopped it all. But is the answer to that to say, oh yeah, the bureaucratic centralism of the European Commission, we need more EU AI acts, we need more of that kind of regulation, that's the future? I mean, does anyone in their right mind really think that, right? And so how does Westminster respond to this now? Westminster doesn't want to face all the technology issues, never has done, right? That's part of the reason why we've got a huge number of problems, is that our political elites and Whitehall elites, for complicated reasons from the kind of 60s and 70s, stepped back from thinking about frontier technology very deliberately and explicitly inside Whitehall. So now people don't want to look at those questions, and they go, oh, well, we've got to... The response to our problems now is, instead of looking at all the very, very obvious big things like totally farcical procurement system, totally farcical planning system, totally farcical energy, totally farcical housing, totally farcical MOD, right? You just go down the list, totally farcical welfare. A Westminster and Whitehall that is pathological on technology and doesn't want to take it seriously. The answer to those problems is to rejoin the EU. Why? Because the old people from the old system are determined not to face reality, determined not to face the future. They just want to retreat to their comfort zone, which is having more stupid cultural wars about Brexit, because that's where they're happy. They don't want to be thinking about the things that we actually started doing in 2019, 2020 to get to grips with the real problems. Now, pretending that rejoining the single market is somehow the great thing when you can barely even see the single market in the data. And if you look at the Draghi report, which of course also is basically ignored in London because it's super bad for the EU, right? But you have a perfect example of the actual EU technocracy itself recently writing about how basically a lot of Europe is deluded on the single market. Westminster doesn't want to face any of those problems either. It doesn't want to actually deal with the nitty-gritty of what British problems are, how you get to grips with them, how you change policy and all these things. It's just all hand-wavy, and it's because the Remain thing became central to their political identity, emotionally. And as a political culture, Westminster stopped being interested and stopped being capable of arguing and discussing these sorts of things. You go back to the 80s, right, and you think about Thatcher, and you go back and look at the newspapers of the time and the news of the time. There's obviously a lot of bitter arguments, but the political class is actually engaged with the real issues of the British economy, right? That is actually what dominates the news. And you have a whole set of people reading things and arguing about them and making complicated arguments in public about what we have to do on privatization, you name it. You look at the 10 years since Brexit, it's basically characterized by Westminster being absolutely pathologically determined not to face any of these core problems in any kind of coherent way. Constant soap opera, and weirdly on both sides in a way, both sides in the sense of the kind of inside Westminster left and right were much happier arguing about all the trans madness in 2020 than they were. The Guardian was, and the Telegraph was. Labour were, and the Tories were. They were happier about arguing about that and Brexit than they were about dealing with any of these other kind of actual core problems.
Yeah.
So as long as you have these parties and as long as you have the civil service that we've got, then and as long as essentially like the senior people are the same, I don't see how that's gonna change.
You make out that it was the 80s that we were sort of dynamic in the 80s. I'm reminded of there's a Dickens book, Little Dorrit, where an inventor has an invention that will sort of supposedly massively improve the health of the nation, and I think it's for the Navy, called Daniel Doyce, and he comes and tries to sell it or provide it to the government, and the Circumlocution Office bats it away. I would suggest that these are problems that are not just 40 years old, but potentially are deeper. My kind of question to you is, Britain has been like this for a long time, and we've sort of muddled on. What now are the sort of things that we could do now to sort of break out of that? Because, if it hasn't changed in 160 years, it's probably not going to. And two, how could we be more of kind of what would then that actually look like? What would the outcomes of that actually be?
So a lot of different things in your question there. So if you go back, I think so. It's definitely the case that a lot of the problems that we see now it's been a slow train coming. That is true. But I think you also have to divide it up in various ways. So if you go back and look at, for example, R.V. Jones and Alan Brooke dealing with two great heroes dealing with the Nazis in World War II, it's interesting in their memoirs and their letters and whatnot of the time, you can see some of today's Whitehall pathologies already there then. That's interesting, right? You then go back a bit further and you look in the period in, like the 10 years or so before 1914, you also see quite a lot of current pathologies in that period, right? A thing which is really, really remarkable, we get into World War I. The kind of proximate cause of that is the Belgian guarantee. Chaos in the cabinet, it's mainly thinking about Ireland. Then this whole looming European situation gradually intrudes itself into the cabinet. And then finally, we have this disaster situation in which we end up fighting over the Belgian guarantee, but having communicated to Germany that we're not going to. So you have this scene, the scenes around about 31st of July in Germany when they're like toasting champagne and saying Britain's going to stay out, and then a couple of days later we're actually in. You then go back and look at it. How many, you think, well, we couldn't have got into World War I on this issue and then not discussed it, right? There must have been all kinds of elite discussions about what does this guarantee mean and what does it mean for military planning, blah, blah, blah. How many discussions were there with senior cabinet and the Prime Minister with the military to discuss the Belgian guarantee? One, in 1911, where the Committee of Imperial Defence has a kind of session and it sort of touches on it, and then it's all very difficult, and it's then, and literally at no point ever again does the cabinet discuss with the military what the hell that is, what are we going to do in certain situations. Sort of extraordinary in a certain way, less extraordinary, like me, you sat and watched COVID happening in the cabinet room, but it feels very similar. Like you feel this huge, I felt in 2020, this feeling of this huge historic crisis is coming, and you look around and you realise, holy shit, this room is sort of like it was in summer 1914. It's confronting this huge thing, but the actual machinery for thinking about it and acting is just completely broken and can't even see it, never mind think intelligently about it.
If that was
so
the case,
those
surely
problems,
does that not mean it's always been broken? That this is just like the nature of large and complicated systems, that they will always struggle to take on these like big challenges.
So in some sense, yes. Yes, in the sense that whenever you have major disruptions on the scale of major wars, Napoleon, blah, 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 obviously all kinds of things are going to be chaos. But I think that there's always going to be chaos, but there's different kinds of chaos, right? And there's different kinds of responses. If you look at, there's a fascinating book called Organising for Victory, written about Pitt and it's kind of 1790s, 1800s, and how Whitehall actually organised itself to deal with the growing threat of Napoleon and whatnot. The story you see there is much different than the story that you see now. And I would say, a lot of the disasters around 1914 and dealing with the Nazis in the 30s are because of particular kinds of bureaucratic problems that certain kinds of bureaucratic entities create. If you look at the 1790s, Whitehall is a very, very different thing. Pitt has actual real meetings like Elon. He actually goes and gets the junior people that know about exactly blah, and he brings them into Downing Street and he quizzes them directly in conversation and says, right, we should do that. And it turns out that Charlie is rubbish. Get Charlie out the way and put so-and-so in instead. So you have this sense of dynamism and actual real players and real responsibility and really building capabilities as well. Completely different attitude towards procurement. 1795 Whitehall is better on procurement than 2025 Whitehall by a massive, massive factor, right? The legal mechanisms were much better. They just paid people off. We've got to build this new armory for the naval station. Right, the locals get bunged blah, build the fucker and get it done. The interplay between the armed forces, building capabilities, technology, procurement, all of that worked way, 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 way better. Your point about, then you've got the new Bismarck state, you look at 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, it does have this strong feel. There's a very interesting book, if you haven't read, called The Weary Titan by a guy called Friedberg, which was interestingly partly, I think, paid for by the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon. And he looks at that then, the kind of internal Whitehall discussions about these kind of issues then. And it's very, very noticeably different. And my argument is fundamental reason why it's different is because of the disaster in the 1850s of the Northcote Trevelyan system, right? That ends the old British constitution in very important ways. Before Northcote Trevelyan, ministers were actually responsible to Parliament in a true, real way. If you go back and look repeatedly at people like Palmerston and whatnot in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they say things. If it goes well, they get the credit for it. If it goes tits up, they're responsible for it, and they're responsible in Parliament, and everyone knows what the system is. And turning up and blathering away about how it's not your fault because the civil service didn't is not, that's not how it's not how things work. After the 1850s, you then start to have this completely different thing growing. You have the Foreign Office changing. And then it's no surprise, right, that then when you look at the outbreak of World War I and you look at the 1930s and you go and read Alan Brooke's memoirs about what the total shit show the Foreign Office was all the way through World War II, the reason is because of Northcote Trevelyan changes and the development of this permanent bureaucracy, which it becomes fundamentally extremely difficult to change outside of actually Churchill in crisis in 1940. Cabinet Office is obviously created in 1917. This is also central to the story, right? Cabinet Office is created in 1917 out of the disaster and failures of the bureaucratic system on the Western Front. But the Cabinet Office is created with two fundamental principles. It does not do policy, and it does not do personnel, right? And everyone agrees, okay, we're creating this thing basically to improve secretarial work between government departments. That's it. But it can't do personnel and it can't do policy. Fast forward a century later, the Cabinet Secretary is literally defined as the chief policy advisor to the Prime Minister and has merged with the head of the civil service to be in charge of all personnel. So the two things that everybody agreed would be a total disaster if the Cabinet Office came to be are now literally its official functions. This tale is central to what's gone wrong inside the British state. And that's why, people constantly ask me, what happened in the cabinet in 2020? You're allowed to sit in these meetings, so what was said, blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, I didn't bother going to the meetings because cabinet, outside of like leadership crises, like in the last week where Starmer might go, that's basically now is the only actual real function for cabinet, is possibly getting rid of a dud prime minister. Apart from that, cabinet has just become a completely Potemkin process. The actual decisions, everyone knows when you work in number 10, are taken by some DG in the cabinet office or in some task force that no one in Parliament even knows exists and the media never report on. That's where the actual decisions are now taken. That's where the real power is. If you ask me, what did the Foreign Secretary think about what was happening on the Brexit negotiations between summer 2019 and the election in 2019, I have to force myself to try and remember who the Foreign Secretary was, because they just weren't important. But I know extremely well who the Prime Minister's private secretary in number 10 was dealing with foreign affairs, because I had to deal with him 5 or 10 times a day, and what he thought was actually really important to the whole process. So that is a very, very huge structural change that's happened, but which is now essentially completely not discussed, right? And the whole way in which politics is discussed in Britain now is really the opposite. It's discussed as if the old system is real, but everyone who's actually on the other side of the number 10 door knows that the old system is totally fake. And that's a big part of the reason why we have, why we're in the situation we are. So, circling back to your main thing, when you've got war, revolution, things like the Great Depression, whatever, anything like that, there's always going to be chaos, right? Because you're dealing with extremely complicated events and humans are imperfect. But there's chaos and there's certain kinds of bureaucratic pathology, and they're different. Pitt had to deal with chaos, but Pitt could actually make decisions and get stuff done because of how the system worked then, in ways that you fast forward to the COVID crisis, everyone just sits there with literally thousands of people dying saying, well, doing any of these things is all defined as illegal, so what do we do? The only thing we can think of is to go to the Prime Minister's office and say, Prime Minister, will you just declare that we should just do these things even though it's all illegal? No one else can think of anything else to do, right? So the fact that the state has evolved in that way, and the fact that the political parties and the media and academia and the old media do not want to discuss these core things, and they want to talk and live as if we're all living in the old Palmerstonian system, where the ministers go into Parliament and say, I take full responsibility, which now, of course, means the opposite of taking full responsibility. When a minister now says in Parliament, I take full responsibility, well, it actually means I take zero responsibility, because I can't replace any of the people, and I may well not even know why the disaster that's on the news even happened in the first place, because no one ever told me and no one ever asked my permission. It's just manifested itself from the bureaucratic shit show. So yes, these things are in many ways very long term. I think that's true. But if you're really going to think about that, I think you have to go back to this fundamental transition from the 1850s and how that started to reprogram all of these institutions like the Treasury and the Foreign Office, and how power then shifted. And then the Cabinet Office change, obviously, in 1917 is also crucial. And that means the Cabinet themselves lose power. The Prime Minister, in lots of ways, loses power. But the Cabinet Office sucks in all of this power.
You're describing pathologies that crop up in pretty much everything the state does at this point. And it brings to mind, actually, the critical minerals. And to me, this crystallizes some of the pathologies that you often write about, because it's very clear to anyone interested in technology that we're going to need a lot more critical minerals over the coming decades, and we can't rely, as the government wants us to, on recycling. But Whitehall is seemingly oblivious to this trend, and the strategy that they released last year kind of acknowledges some of the situation, but doesn't really acknowledge the kind of multiplying of critical mineral harvesting that we'll require. So we're in this situation where the US is going to get there first, and we're going to get squashed. And to me, it seems to, as I say, really crystallize these these faults.
Yeah, but I think you can multiply that across. It's a much broader phenomenon, right?
Imagine that happening in like
the fundamental phenomenon is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, Westminster then, well, the Western world in general becomes, in all sorts of ways, super complacent. And actually, you can read it in Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs. It's interesting how he talks about the kind of transition in Western elites pre-89-91 period to post-89-91 period. Post-91, they basically say, this is just a total vindication of everything that we do. We've won the Cold War. Now our big push is to lecture everyone outside Europe and North America about democracy and human rights, which, of course, goes in an increasingly left-wing direction on every dimension. And in Britain, it particularly develops a pathology for the single most important thing is Britain supporting international law. Now, Chagos is obviously a particularly amusing example, tragicomic example of this, where that is Westminster's overriding priority. Even when you actually look at the court and the process and whatnot, it's completely farcical, right? It's all actually being manipulated by the Russians and the Chinese. It's totally corrupt. In no remotely serious way is this an actually decent process. But that doesn't matter anymore in Westminster. It's simply labelled international law, therefore it's the highest thing. Officials came to me in 2019 about this Chagos thing, and they said, well, there's going to be the International Tribunal that's going to rule blah, 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 so we're going to have to give it away. What the fuck are you talking about? It's just some bullshit tribunal. It's ours. We're going to keep it. No, we're not even going to start a fucking process. Like, Dominic, can we just start a process to have the Prime Minister discuss with the lawyers? No, because as soon as you start a process, you're then legitimising this entire farcical bullshit process. We're not having any meetings with the Prime Minister. We're not engaging with this thing. Tell this fucking tribunal that Chagos Islands is British and it's going to fucking stay British, and we don't care what some Chinese judge or anybody else says. That's our position. And by the way, the US deep state has an extremely deep interest in what happens on Chagos, and they are going to be supportive, and we're not going to be handing it over. Panic, panic, panic. Why? Because the Foreign Office doesn't regard its job, and the Cabinet Office lawyers did not regard their job as upholding British interests as their number one thing. They regarded their number one priority as doing what the lawyers say international law wants, and what some international lawyers meeting in Strasbourg or whatever might say is the right thing to do. Remember, we had to exclude large parts of the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office from the Brexit negotiations because they were leaking to our enemies. Mm. The Cabinet Secretary came into the Prime Minister's office in 2019 and said, I'm extremely sorry, Prime Minister. I must apologise on behalf of the civil service. For the first time in Britain's recorded history, the government's own lawyers are leaking to undermine the British government in international negotiations. I'm afraid because there's a lot of people inside the Cabinet Office that are very strongly on the Remain side. Right? That's the actual situation with how this thing has developed. Look at Herma and look at the lawfare situation, right? That's in some ways it's even more morally disgraceful. Over the last few years, you have a situation in which SAS in Hereford are tasked on black operations, fly into place X or Y, execute Operation Z against this terrorist entity. They do it. They get back off the helicopter on the tarmac in some shithole country, and they're literally arrested for murder by Plod. Right? That has literally been happening repeatedly over the last few years because elements of the MOD, elements of the Cabinet Office, elements of the Foreign Office, and the government legal service think that what a set of lawyers looking at the European Convention of Human Rights think about certain things trumps everything else. And if some lawyer sitting in the Cabinet Office says, well, I reviewed this drone footage And I must say, I think he was a bit hasty in this gunfight, right? I know it sounds farcical, right? But this is literally what's happening. You have a bunch of total tools in the Cabinet Office looking at drone footage and saying, well, he could have maybe given it another 3 seconds before he fired, right? As all fucking hell is breaking loose in the middle of some Syrian village and bombs are going off and IEDs are going off. And the lawyer says, oh, well, I think that. Oh, well, the lawyer thinks that. Well, we better start investigating it then. Get that guy in. Right? It's completely batshit crazy thing that no one would kind of almost believe is possible. When I said, you can go back, right? I said in 2021, possibly 2022, we're in a situation where because of how Cabinet Office lawyers have defined things, we are drone striking people in the third world because that is deemed lawful under the ECHR, when Special Forces and the MOD have said we could actually nab that guy coming out the building, lift him, put him on a helicopter, fly him to X, interrogate him, try and find out what the fuck is actually going on, burrow into the terrorist organization, get actual intel. No, you can't do that. That's unlawful. That's unlawful, but droning him is lawful. That's what the lawyers say, right? Completely crazy. I say that publicly. What happens? All of these QCs and whatnot go, this is obviously total conspiracy theory. Nothing this insane could possibly be true, blah, blah, blah. Now, of course, like all these things that I say about how the system works is all now leaking out, and now it's actually no longer denied, and it's been officially stated, and former Tory ministers have all confirmed on the record that this is what's happening. This is the product of the situation that you're talking about, when you have a combination of pathological bureaucracy, decisions being sucked away from any kind of responsible ministers into parts of the Cabinet Office that have now zero political oversight, zero political visibility of any kind, operating entirely with the likes of Herma and pro-Remain maniac, commie, anti-British lawyers sitting in the Cabinet Office. They're the ones driving these processes.
I think it's interesting you say this. I played the other day with Claude, and I tried to play through a sort of diplomatic situation in Kashmir. And I went, right, I'm going to be really pro-British, and I'm going to be really, forceful. And you try and say some of this stuff, and immediately Claude pushed back and goes, well, actually, your cabinet secretary is going to start briefing against you. Ministers will resign. This whole thing will fall apart because actually it's literally impossible to try and do what you are trying to do. And part of that as well was because, you have whatever side you kind of picked, you'd have, your Pakistani MPs would resign of one and Indian MPs would resign of the other. That is just, a problem that we have. Yeah. We have to remember that a lot of these systems emerged out of kind of horror of the First World War and horror of war. You said that there was one cabinet meeting about the Belgian guarantee, but that wasn't because Sir Grey was basically just having everything in his head, that these systems were very dependent on individuals, and individuals, it's hard to systematize an individual. This is the inevitable process that happens through systematization. We talked before we started recording about Hong Kong refusing to collect statistics because, that would then prevent them from interfering. Yeah. Is this just the plate of democracies, the modern democracy now, that actually voters keep on more freebies, the rich will keep pressing the more immigration button. There's no way of kind of summoning up enough power to break down these obstacles. The people who can stay in their job for multiple terms on end, i.e. lawyers and civil servants, are just there because they're more stable, right? They can have longer careers and understand how everything works.
I mean, again, there's lots of different questions wrapped up in.
Take your pick.
So it's clear that a lot of what we're talking about the bureaucracies are common Western things, right? And COVID was a complete demonstration proof of this, because you see practically identical problems happening in every Western country. Exactly the same patterns of failure, exactly the same problems of procurement, over and over again. You also see in Britain and America identical processes whereby, because Britain and America are different than continental Europe in various ways, we spat out, each of us, a different process to do vaccines than the EU did, which was much more effective and much faster. But then in both places, the response of the deep state was close them both down rather than keep going and figure out what may be wrong with these vaccines, how might we have fucked up, what should the next generation be. The vaccine that we actually want is one that you just squirt up your nose and then you don't pass on the disease, right? Which the scientists wanted to do and which could have happened. In both places, the institutions looked at Operation Warp Speed and in Britain, the Vaccine Task Force, and said, this is a total disaster for us. Because why? Because it's demonstrating that if you create something with not normal procurement, not normal HR, not normal regulation, and you bring in people from outside the civil service who actually know what the fuck they're doing, oh my goodness. Well, amazingly, everything goes 100 times faster and is 100 times more productive. This is a disaster, right? So they closed down vaccines. In Britain, they also closed down testing. They closed down sewage monitoring. Right? I think we were the first country in the world to do a bunch of things, thanks to Ben Warner in 2020 on sewage monitoring.
We actually interviewed Mark Warner.
Exactly. His brother Mark then actually helped build it with faculty and some excellent officials. Nature write papers about it. Dozens of countries all over the world copy. What happens in 2021? Britain closes it down. Britain's tried to do it again, to restart it 4 times. And Whitehall is so completely broken, 4 times in a row, it's proved unable even to restart it, right? We did it once, we closed it, and Whitehall literally can't reopen it. So, very clear patterns of problem. Exactly the same things repeated in country after country, but also a fascinating other pattern, right, which is in basically no country in the Western world did the opposition say, here is the catalogue of failures of the deep state in all sorts of ways. We invested all this money supposedly in pandemic preparation. It was all total shit show, clearly failed. Right. When you vote for us and we get in, we're going to actually get to the bottom of all of this and we're going to change how all of this works. No one, anywhere did it. What actually happened, everywhere across the Western world, there's actually consensus in the old school parties should defend the old system. When Elon said, prosecute Fauci, everyone in Westminster is completely appalled. Elon is completely correct, right? Because now it's impossible to deny, but Fauci was lying about everything. Fauci was spending all this money on gain of function and whatnot, and then cheating it and lying about it. There was an actual conspiracy in Q1 2020 to hide all this and to get Nature and Science and all these journals to lie about it as well. I actually witnessed this in the Prime Minister's office as well, with everyone saying to the PM, it is 100% guaranteed that this was not a lab leak and it's scientifically proven, and the people saying that this might be engineered or blah, 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 talking nonsense. Thanks to James Phillips, who I brought into Number 10, who'd actually worked on... Has he been on the pod?
Yeah,
okay, great. So James had come over and you literally had a situation in which all these people at Number 10 are saying, oh, no, this is impossible, this is scientifically impossible, blah, blah, blah. And James Phillips says to me, I've literally, this happens in labs all the time. I don't know why they think this is not possible. This became possible 3 years ago, and people do this kind of stuff with genetic engineering. You're just being told complete garbage. So, but my main point was, the most fascinating thing, the theory of democracy is when these sort of things happen, there is political advantage from the opposition parties in blowing the whistle and saying, this is obviously a failure, we're going to do things differently. But what you actually saw was a purely pathological response across the Western world, which was the opposition parties dug in to support the likes of Fauci and all the things that had failed. That was extremely interesting. You then have Ukraine. You have a very similar process happen on Ukraine, right? Where nominally, again, a kind of completely bizarro thing, Because nominally you have an unprecedented unity across all mainstream, that the Ukraine war is great and Ukraine is not a completely corrupt nightmare country run by mafia KGB, but a beacon of democracy. Zelensky is a new little Winston Churchill, blah, 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 right? That's the official story. The official story is we will do whatever it takes to make sure that Putin will fail. And in some sense, psychologically, all of these people parroting this clearly actually believe it, right? They're not lying. But then if you look at what have they done, they have in Britain, they completely doubled down on supporting all the worst aspects of the MOD. So in 2020, MOD admits dozens and dozens and dozens of projects are multi-billion pound total fiascos and they should be closed. We should actually move the money out of these things and into there. All secretly, they admit this. And the procurement system is completely fucked and we should all shift to a different way of doing it. Right, okay. Ukraine happens, they promise Putin must fail, we promise whatever it takes. What do they actually do? They put all the money into all the things that are completely broken, and they double down on a completely pathological MOD procurement system that can't build anything at scale or at pace. But they all keep giving interviews about how Putin must fail. And they actually do mean it emotionally. They do want to do things. But the one thing they will not do is change procurement law so you can actually build anything. So you have two things happen together, which doesn't make any kind of sense, right? Like no one a priori would predict that. You could say, we really value the current system, so like Ukraine's, sorry Ukraine, but it's on its own and we're just going to keep how we do things because that's our actual priority. Or you could say, we really care about Ukraine and therefore we're going to change procurement. It's completely batshit to say we really care about Ukraine and we're going to keep the current procurement system and not debate it. Yet that is what the entirety of Westminster did. And like on COVID, did you see anyone in Labour going, but hang on, Boris, hang on, Sunak, you keep saying you really care about Ukraine, but like we can't actually make any of these drones. We've got this retarded watchkeeper program that everyone in the MOD knows is stupid. Why are you doing that? Why are we not actually doing the real thing? Ukraine keeps asking, why can't we come and do drones at scale in Britain? And the MOD keeps refusing and rejecting them to do it. Do you see anyone in Labour say that? No. So again, you see this pattern, right, where both parties revealed preferences. The actual important thing is not to challenge how the deep state works and not actually even to engage and even discuss it. Again, important to stress, this is not just a British thing. It's basically the same across all Western countries. Now, there's obviously some differences in defence. Some countries like Finland and Estonia and whatnot act on some of these things a bit differently because they're right on Russia's border. But overall, the really striking thing is how common these patterns are across the Western world.
What explains that? Why is this just a nature? Is this just a inevitable consequence of prosperity? I mean, things like NIMBYism, I'd have thought were, the product of people in highly urbanized, packed conditions having to find a way of getting on, right?
Isn't it more fruitful to ask about how we actually deal with this problem? Like, should we be is it in Britain's interest to be remaking international institutions? Or should we retreat from bodies like the WHO?
I think we should largely get out of them. I mean, either ignore them or actively leave. And new things are being built. The idea of reforming any of these things is basically impossible. The only
because
people,
China has all the leverage, right? So
partly because of that, but also just even Britain and Europe. Europe is in favour of just putting more and more money into all of these useless things anyway. Right? So Europe's never going to argue for anything. The only people that could actually exercise some leverage on it is America, because they're the ones, generally speaking, who put in the money. And if America says, "Look, either change X or we're yanking all the cash," that might have some effect. But Britain can't. Britain by itself can't change any of these things. I think, in general, it would be much more fruitful for Britain to be be ad hoc in terms of international alliances and creating new things. So if it's precious minerals, for example, then we should just go to America and whatever allies we've got,
start printing
and say, right, here's our thing.
Yeah.
And here's our new system. And if you want to be part of this alliance to do blah, 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 blah. And maybe that alliance also does some other naval stuff. And maybe it also does some anti-piracy stuff or whatever. And just, again, ignores what the UN is doing in places like Somalia and says, right, the following 10 countries will sort out the Somalia piracy problem and the trawler problem and the this problem and the that problem. And you just do it. And you just kind of ignore whatever the bullshit UN committee is, and you just move on. That's the only way you're going to see progress on lots of these things.
How can we apply this to other fields like biotech and space? I mean, as I understand it, we can actually make our own rules on biotech and space, but we could be more adventurous.
Well, yeah, I mean, in 100 ways, right? But that goes back to the core problem. The Whitehall priority is not making progress in any of these things. Yeah. The Whitehall priority is saying we are part of the old, completely crumbling rules-based order, and Whitehall will go down like that, like comical Ali in Baghdad, shouting, "We support." They'll be the last people off that bus. So the problem, I think, that a lot of whether it's YIMBYs, whether it's the tech people, whatever, I think it's a mistake in a way to think of Whitehall as, people often discuss it as if like there's an argument to be won, and then if you actually win that argument and we agree that we've got to make progress on these things, then Whitehall will actually do that. It's a category error. Because Whitehall doesn't care about the things that you're talking about. It doesn't care about solving the housing problem. It doesn't care about biotech. It doesn't care. Whitehall cares about preserving existing power and existing institutions and existing budgets. And it cares most importantly about itself retaining control over its own personnel caste system. That is its actual priority. And everything will always be sacrificed to that. As you saw in COVID, as you could see in Ukraine, as you can see on everything. So we can say, right, well, if you really care about doing blah, 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 then it's logical to do these things. But that is evading the core problem. The core problem is Whitehall's actual priority is stopping you do the sensible thing, because doing the sensible thing is undermining their real priorities. See what I mean?
Well, okay, let's play it forward.
That can only be overcome by one thing.
Let's play it forward.
That's having a prime minister who actually cares and is prepared to use his full constitutional authority to say to Whitehall, we are no longer playing your game. Everyone who doesn't get on board with the following things will be removed.
Should we play a little game of what would Otto von Bismarck do?
Well, in the sense that let's take the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So
or Lee Kuan Yew.
Or Lee Kuan Yew. The British Prime Minister announces that he's going to start issuing these licenses. What? These are then government lawyers say
absolute meltdown.
Meltdown in the press, meltdown by a lot of government lawyers. Yep. How do they try and stop him? One.
Well, first of all, they say it's unlawful.
Sure.
Secondly, they say it's against the Civil Service Code for us to work on this, and that there'll be some serious resignations, Prime Minister. But remember, again, I saw this with my own eyes. In 2020, Jonathan Jones, then the senior lawyer in the Cabinet Office, said what the government is trying to do. It was a very interesting test case, right? Jones said what the government is trying to do with this primary legislation is unlawful under international law, and therefore I will not work on it and do it. Very radical move, right? Because the old constitutional position in Britain for centuries has been British Parliament can write whatever it wants in domestic law. And if it says it's lawful in domestic law, then it's lawful. And international law and treaties do not grip domestic law unless they are instantiated in domestic law by domestic legislation, right? That is the classical, agreed, conventional position of the British Constitution. What Jones and people like Jones said was, to protect the rule of law, we oppose the following things because it breaks international law in our interpretation. So they allied the rule of law with what we as lawyers say is international law, and then we define it as unlawful for civil servants to operate against the rule of law. Do you see what I mean? Now, the way you solve it is to do what I did in 2020 and say, fantastic news that you can't participate in this. I want rid of you. Good luck with your resignation. Off you go. And Jones left. So that if you want to do these sort of things, you have to be prepared to say, we are removing these people from the civil service. If you are not prepared to do that, then you will not get anywhere, because the officials will simply refuse to do what you want. And they'll say, you can't do it, Prime Minister, because it's unlawful. And it's not lawful for us to actually participate in what you're talking about. Behind the scenes, one of the things which is going on at the moment is officials are looking to work with Herma to actually rewrite the civil service code again to make some of this kind of thing explicit so that they can inch their way forward into the courts, trying to get a judgment from the High Court or something, which then solidifies some of this kind of revolutionary constitutional thinking. They want to start getting instantiated in some kind of High Court judgment, which they can then turn around and say to the political authorities and the Prime Minister's office in the future, well, it's now just unlawful to do this because the court said so, so no, tough shit, you can't do any of these things. All right, so that process is inching along in the background. But the fundamental answer to your question is, in many, many areas of trying to get your bulldoze your way through this system, the single most fundamental thing is, are you prepared to remove the officials or not? The officials have incredibly good senses for this question. Extremely good. So you could go to official after official after official who's currently senior in the system, presided over one disaster after another for their entire career, totally useless characters. But they have brilliant senses for watching the MPs and trying to figure out what are their real priorities, what do they really care about, what will they fight about. And they're extremely good at manoeuvring them with legal advice, which they do constantly. Often, by the way, literally writing memos saying, legal advice says you can't do blah, 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 where if you then say, bring the legal advice to my office, there is no fucking document. It doesn't even exist. So they literally just invent it sometimes completely as well, parenthetically. That shows you the kind of games that are played on that. But the only way you can actually bulldoze your way through these problems is if you're prepared to bring in these people and say, right, out, 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 out. In 2020, the only way that we could get various emergency things done on COVID was literally me bringing people into number 10 and saying to them, if the following thing doesn't happen in 24 hours, I'm going to tell the Prime Minister to remove you from the building. And after weeks and weeks of everyone dicking around going nowhere, like that was the one. And they knew because it was me saying it, he will actually do that. So, well, okay, suddenly then things unlock and things change in less than 24 hours. But that's the only reason why it happened, right? The fact that 30,000 people might die because you haven't got enough tests is not enough for them to actually do the thing. It's only if you say Buggins is out in hours that suddenly the system will act. And the fundamental thing is the MPs do not do that. The MPs don't understand how to get things done. Very few MPs have ever been in any kind of high-performance organisation. They've got no concept of what direct responsibility even means themselves. They've never been in an organisation where people have direct responsibility. So they have no way of actually dealing with these kind of complicated things, right? They've done PPE or some other bullshit degree. They arrive in these jobs. They've never hired and fired. They've never built anything. They don't know how responsibility works. And then they're surrounded by people who, generally speaking, are cleverer than them and who also they can also say, well, the legal advice is blah, so you're just constrained. Oh, well, we just have to do that then, and it's not my fault. And the officials create a psychological environment in which, right, so that's illegal. You can't actually do that. You run off and give your interview to the Spectator and go and do your podcast and blah, 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 blah. And we'll treat you like a little king and you can have a chauffeur and various, ambassadors from Africa will come in and kowtow to you and pretend you're important. Meanwhile, we'll actually just get on with running everything. and you go and do the Potemkin bits. And 99% of the MPs have been happy with that, right? Now, going back to what you said before, I think a crucial element of what's changed now is, right, if the economy is growing at 3% a year and there's more and more money, a lot of these pathological things can keep going for a very long time because there's always more money. Okay, it doesn't work very well, but every year the real terms budget goes up because you're growing at 3% a year. One of the things which is breaking the system now is because they've screwed the economy up so badly and there's no growth, these things need actual budget increases just to fail, right? If you say, oh, your budget is flat, a whole bunch of shit just starts breaking instantly. Even if you give them more money, these things are now so broken, right? Look at the NHS, right? You could increase its real terms budget by blah each year, but things would just still keep breaking.
The demographics
all
get
kinds
worse
of
at a faster
everything
rate.
is exactly everything is breaking faster than 1 or 2% real terms growth. But large parts of the system now, I don't know what a good example is. I mean, look at the courts, I suppose, is one good example, right? Total disastrous handling from the Tories on everything to do with crime in the courts. Courts have had not only no real terms increases, not even flat, but actual real terms cuts. So, of course, the entire court system is in a total meltdown, and they're just punting out like multiple child rapists out onto the streets and letting everyone go because the system's in complete meltdown. So I think that what you said earlier is a critical factor now in what's happening. The old 3% growth could mask a lot of these pathologies. And the voters kind of like, well, if I feel better each year, feel as though like life's going on the up each year, how much do I really care about the MOD being a shit show? Not that much, right? How much do I really care about importing Somalis who then just take all the money and export it back to Mogadishu? Not that much. It's invisible. The media doesn't report it, and my life's getting better, okay? That was the story of the 90s up until 2008. But what's happened in 2008 in the financial crash is a bunch of richer people, middle classes, people with assets recovered, bounced back, and have got richer and richer post-2008. But in many parts of the country, people have never recovered from 2008, right? Their lives have just been in fucking misery since then, in an unprecedented way, right? You've got to go back to kind of like pre-Napoleon to have a situation in large parts of Britain where you have actual no real terms growth for like 15, 20 years, right? Literally unprecedented. You can have 2 world wars didn't manage to do that. But we've now got that. And that is their part of this problem. So you've got stagnant growth. You've got completely pathological institutions that actually need real terms increases in money just to stand still. And you've got political parties and senior civil servants completely dedicated to not changing how anything works. And if you put those 3 things together, you've got what we can see all around us, which is every part of the system now failing and those failings interacting with each other in various ways, right? So you got a shit show with you can't deport people, but you're scraping up immigrant like crazy Afghans off the street and putting them in prison. But then that means you've got to let all these people out, and then that means you've got and then that means you've got and then that means the budgets for this are all knackered as well. So all of these things are now starting to ping into each other in. So you haven't just got, one defunct bureaucracy, that defunct bureaucracy, internal silos going haywire. You've also got horizontally them all smashing into each other and breaking, but also no one has authority to deal with the interactions between all these different parts of the system.
You're describing this unbelievable Gordian knot, right? And it will be basically impossible to slice through it.
No, it's not impossible. It's not impossible. In all sorts of ways, Britain is actually the best placed country in the West because of our constitution, which, of course, is another interesting thing. So, in practical terms, it is much easier to do real regime change in Britain than it is in America or anywhere in Europe because of unwritten constitution and the weird way in which powers of the Prime Minister actually work. So, unlike Trump, the Prime Minister can go in today and say, fired, government department is closed and I'm creating this new government department. The civil service have to do it, and the courts can't stop and even judicially review these things, right? No other Western country is that possible. That is why you see two things happening on the left. Now, one, change the electoral system to PR. And then secondly, discussions about how you encode protections for the civil service to make it extremely difficult to actually do what I'm talking about. So what they're thinking is, and it's actually logical from their point of view, if you pass certain kinds of legislation defending the current Whitehall system, and then you do PR, it becomes effective, even if you haven't got an actual written constitution and the revolution of that and the difficulty from their point of view of how to do that. If you just do those two things, you make it practically extremely hard for anybody coming in to actually change anything. You completely now embed the current catastrophic situation, which is what they want to do. They want to make it impossible. What they're terrified of is Farage doing some kind of Doge type thing and saying, right, I'm going to bring in 20 hotshots, fire all the perm secs, put them in charge of this, use the actual powers of the PM, close, open, fire, and then pass a whole series of primary legislation. Repeal the Human Rights Act, repeal the Equalities Act, reform how judicial review works, bin the Climate Change Act, ... right? You go through 15 things. You whack them all in year one with primary legislation, the CRAG Act as well, Civil Service Commissioners, If you have like an actual serious list of these things, you could go through. The right way to do it would be you draft all this legislation in opposition, you make the case in the election in the manifesto, you win on the Thursday, Monday morning, these bills go hammering through into Parliament. And you also make clear to the House of Lords, we said this, anyone thinks that they can fuck around, we're going straight to the King, we'll appoint 600 new peers. You're not doing that either, right? It'll be blitzkrieg on you guys. And you smash that through in primary legislation. So you have that combination of primary legislation changing fundamentals and you actually use the constitutional powers of the PM, as I've discussed, the whole thing starts to shift, right? That's what they are terrified of, correctly from their point of view, in Whitehall, in Labour, in the Inner Temple, etc., etc. And that's why you start to see this mix of rejoin the EU, PR, censorship, and how do we have like embedding legislation to protect the civil service? And they're thinking, right, well, if we can bring off some combination of those things, then we get to the state we want to, which is we don't have to worry about elections anymore. They've convinced themselves that everyone who doesn't agree with them now is fascist. That's the other thing that's happened, right? So they don't think, if you go back to like pre-referendum, right, people hated me, like mainstream people in the system in Westminster hated me, but sort of thought I was like crazy, stupid, wrong. But they didn't say I was actually a fascist who should be in jail. Now their argument about people like me is that we're actually fascists who should be in jail and shouldn't be allowed to actually participate in democratic politics, right? People like Dominic Cummings and whatnot said Cummings should be jailed and Parliament should pass laws to forbid him from participating in future elections. And that's not a weird position. If you look at what's happened in the States, right? If anyone had said 10 years ago, former Democratic nominees to be president will publicly describe the First Amendment as, quote, a historic mistake that must be fixed, unquote, everyone would have said, including me, that's crazy. No way could that be the case. Before the 2024 election, Hillary and John Kerry both said that very, very explicitly. And I think that's very important, very important. Like they truly, what you could sort of describe as the mainstream left, really have persuaded themselves that anyone not with them is part of a fascist conspiracy, possibly working with Putin. and is beyond the kind of bounds of democratic acceptability, and therefore must be closed down, arrested, and treated in that manner, which is super dangerous, right? You can see it in the States, in some ways more clearly than here for the moment, but the dynamic in the States is moving very rapidly towards you're just going to start jailing your opponents. That is what that's what the emerging picture is for the next 5 years.
And this is downstream, right? Of, I think you talk about this in your writing about there being no political class that actually really knows each other or likes each other anymore, right? That when you're just pulling random people from a population, you identify far more with your ideology. There's far less of a sort of convivial attitude to your enemy. So it means that you can't really have a coherent body politic anymore. Yeah. The only thing to do is win or you get jailed, right? That is the breakdown of democracies as you move from a coherent political class that has a coherent political culture and agreed standards and norms.
I mean, I partly agree with that, but I think there's a couple of other things. One is the implosion of, I think, the effect of the internet. Okay, a few different effects from that. Number one, it brings a lot of transparency into things that were previously not transparent. And that's been super bad for all kinds of elites. It's been bad for Harvard. It's been bad for the BBC. It's been bad for public health experts. It's bad for military experts. Or it's bad for all kinds of supposed elites. So you move from a world in like 1970s to a world of today where you can just go on the internet straight away and you can go, oh, this supposedly high status professor or government minister or whatever is just talking like obvious crap. All institutions' credibility and trust in them has declined because of this force. Lots of ways this is a healthy force, but it's also for sure simultaneously destabilizing in various ways, right? Simultaneously, you have a crack up of consensus reality amongst the elites. So what are even basic facts is also cracked up, right? One of the themes probably is similar to you on WhatsApp now, right, is you get sent something, like, is that real or is that fake? Oh, it's like everyone, the Tories and Labour all say that's a conspiracy theory, but that's another conspiracy that turns out to actually be true. You know what I mean? So I think that's another very important thing. It's increasingly hard to know what's true and what's not true. And therefore you have different inside the kind of political elites, you also have now these kind of silos and different networks. Blue Sky is an interesting example of it, right? So the Blue Sky flight post-November 2024. So if you look at Blue Sky now, where a lot of the high-status Westminster people hobnob, it's a completely different information environment where a lot of stories simply don't exist. Right, so if some story happens, let me think of an example. An example is like the Supreme Court judgment on the trans ruling, right? It's big enough that Westminster, the MPs and whatnot, and the government ministers have to do something about it and think about it that day because the Supreme Court has said that, right? You go look at Blue Sky, tumbleweed. The professors of political science and the FT pundits are just ranting at each other all day about Elon and whatever, some like very niche thing about Texas or something that day. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was very interesting watching. Well, they just didn't discuss it. The Supreme Court judgment on trans, it's like, how can we even comment on that without ignore? So the subject doesn't exist. You look at a whole bunch of stories that might happen on a day regarding crime, immigration, right? Some crazed migrant slaughters someone or whatever it might be. One set of people in Westminster are looking very carefully at that and saying, right, where the hell does he come from? How did he arrive in this country? Which authorities failed, blah, blah, blah. Look, on Blue Sky, story doesn't exist. So I think that's another thing which has happened. You have collapse of consensus realities. You have all of these MPs running around physically co-located with the journalists in Westminster, the same as they have been for hundreds of years. But what's actually going on in their heads and what's going on in their phones is radically different. And their perception of stories and politics becomes radically different, right? So you have, what's another example? Like on the Ukraine war. Pipeline gets blown up. Everyone says, well, this is terrible. Putin's blown up the pipeline. I say, why would Putin blow up the pipeline? That's like his pipeline. That would be really stupid. That pipeline gives him leverage. Putin shell, psychopath, moron, da da da. 6 months later, New York Times quietly says, CIA say that actually the Ukrainians blew up the pipeline. It wasn't Putin after all. Zero coverage. No one updates to that fact at all. Doesn't change the story of how they think about Ukraine at all. It's got completely different informational realities on these things. So I think that is another really important thing. And almost by definition as well, it's almost impossible to discuss, right? So an effect of that has been a kind of breakdown of discussion. Before 2015, 2016, I would argue with a lot of these people and discuss things, and they'd say you're stupid and blah, blah, blah. But there was interaction and there was some kind of debate. To a large extent, that's ended because they think I'm insane and I think they're insane. So kind of what's the point of talking to each other? They think it's pointless talking to me and I think it's pointless talking to them. So that's another, I think, very, very big change, and no short-term thing is going to fix that. The leader creates a system where there is direct personal responsibility through the organization.
Yeah.
And that pattern is repeated. So you can see that pattern whether in state things like General Groves in the Manhattan Project in World War II, and you can see it today if you go and look at how SpaceX works with Elon, right? But the cultural difference of going from organizations like that and then you walk into the Cabinet Office, it's like just walking into an insane asylum. Because everything in the Cabinet Office operates on the exact opposite principle. And not just in the negative sense of things don't exist, but in an anti-sense of when you sit in meetings in the Cabinet Office, it's extremely explicit and clear that you can't talk about personal responsibility. Like, that's bullying or fascism. Like, you just can't have a whole set of conversations. So if you sit there and go, hang on a second, like, for example, I'll give you an example recently, right? Spilled out into the public domain about this whole massive shit show where Whitehall let the Chinese just buy all of this critical infrastructure, which is used to communicate secret data between the MOD, intelligence services, Cabinet Office and whatnot, right? It's a sort of thing where, it's a classic thing where if I put it on my blog 10 years ago, everyone would have said, that's totally batshit. The GCH, the MI6 big listening station on the outskirts of on the M25, right, sits, there's a listening station with a whole bunch of equipment in it, which sucks in MI6 stations from globally. China didn't bug it. China bought the fucking building that the thing sits in. They bought the whole thing. Right? Completely crazy. Completely crazy. They didn't need to bug it because they bought the whole building and all the wires going in and out. So when I was actually originally briefed on that in the bunker underneath number 10 in summer 2020, and I go, so Cabinet Secretary, just so I'm clear, because what you're saying sounds so batshit, I want to just say it in my own words so we're clear about what you're telling us. And I repeat it, and he goes, yes, Dominic, that is what's happened. And I go, right, okay. So which official signed off Global Switch buying all of this in 2018 or whatever it was? Which actual official? Because someone must have approved it. Everyone, you can see they all go in the chair. Dominic, that is not the discussion which we're here to have. We're here to inform the Prime Minister, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know. But there's a lot of things this conversation should have. And one of the things that we should have is, if you have a fuck up so massive as this, how did it actually happen? And which particular people made these decisions and why? So that we need to figure that out. So how the hell do we not know that this is not happening again all over the system, right?
Do you think that system, that's still possible to be the sort of, CEO, Prime Minister? Or has it almost decayed so much that you can come in and you can try and take on as much personal responsibility as you want? Because I imagine you saw a little bit of this, right? So, okay, I'll be the guy.
It depends.
It still moves around you and tries to make sure that you can't have that responsibility.
So in the current situation, it doesn't exist, and everything is set up to avoid it happening. And there's also a huge amount of theatre goes in to try to program the PM psychologically so that the PM doesn't even literally know what their powers are. Yeah. So, for example, one thing that I noticed, which I think was really interesting, is that there's this process whereby on a Friday, into the PM's box goes a whole bunch of appointments. Right? But the way they do it is amazingly clever. The first ones, the PM, imagine you're Prime Minister, right? You've gone through a week. It's now Friday, 9 o'clock. You've poured yourself a large drink and you've been given this fucking box that you're told you've got to look at it overnight and then hand it in tomorrow. It's your prep. And you pull out, and the top one is, the Queen is appointing the Bishop of Leicester, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, tick, right? Right. And these are things where no Prime Minister has actually made a view since maybe Gladstone on bishops, right? I think Gladstone is the last person who actually said, no, we're having so-and-so as the bishop of what. So no one in 150 years has actually. But constitutionally, because of our weird system, it's still the Queen appoints and the Prime Minister has to, formally approve, even though it's not a real decision. So what they do is they give the PM a bunch of these things, right? And then it's the DG in charge of technology working with the intelligence services is moving to DEFRA to deal with cows. Tick as well, right? Because it's just I don't know what the fuck this list is, but my job is to tick them all through. If the Prime Minister does what I started doing and go cross, everyone's like, the fuck are you doing? Officials coming to me, the Prime Minister's just put written no on these appointments. What the hell's going on? So, well, are you saying that these are they're all like the Bishop of Leicester? In which case, the whole thing, tell him that, right? Well, no, Dominic, come on. They're obviously not all like the Bishop of Leicester. Right, so he is allowed to say that the DG for tech is not moving. Well, formally, he could, but, it's completely improper. And what on earth does the Prime Minister know about a DG? And, does he even know who that is? I mean, I think we all know, Dominic, that you don't want Phil Duffy to move because you're working with him and you want him to stay there because you're doing a whole bunch. Okay, you don't want that, but the PM doesn't know shit about this. And it's not your job to interfere in civil service appointments. So that's why we're unhappy and why we're saying it's improper. Formally, the PM can do that for once, but that's not what's happening. You've got the PM to scupper it, but you shouldn't have any involvement with this. You shouldn't even see the fucking document. You see what I mean? Yeah. But that's how they tried to condition it, right? They tried to condition the PM into thinking that they don't actually have this. And I had that conversation repeatedly in 2020 during COVID, where I would have to say to him, Cabinet Secretary, please explain to the PM that he actually has the authority to do X. And Sedwell would say, Dominic's right, if you want to do blah. There was one where I said, hang on a second, you're all talking about, we have to appoint so-and-so or so-and-so to this thing. Couldn't we just, the actual constitutional position is the PM can appoint whoever he wants to as a minister. Prime Minister goes, what are you talking about? Of course I can't. Cabinet Secretary goes, Dominic is correct, Prime Minister, and Churchill actually did it on a few occasions. What? I can appoint who I want? What? Oh, right, well, that was all part of the conversation about Kate Bingham and the vaccine task force, right? You can just do... But the whole system tries increasingly over the years successfully to try to make the PM think that you just can't do that. And that will be undermining the norms of the system, Prime Minister. And of course, I wouldn't say this personally, But some might say that it's, Trump-like or even Orban-like behaviour for you to try to exercise power in that way. It will be seen as really the foundations of our system and the rule of law prime minister will be regarded as creaking very dangerously. Oh, well, no. Well, I mean, obviously, I completely respect the rule of law, so I'm free, and I wouldn't possibly do anything that might be construed in such a way. Of course, Prime Minister, we knew, it was just a misunderstanding, Prime Minister, I don't know. My fundamental argument 10 years ago, and the argument I made in Downing Street, and the argument I made subsequent to Downing Street, that COVID and Ukraine and whatnot made my point, that rebuilding Britain's economy and rebuilding British politics and government capacity and everything else, and armed forces, MOD, must have at its centre that science and technology becomes a fundamental aspect of the PM's job and the PM's priorities. It's not just some fourth order issue that you appoint a junior science minister to, and they run around having meetings. But real politics and the big issues of Westminster are obviously separate. Right? That's how Westminster has thought about it for at least 50 years or so. I was hopeful that the combination of Brexit and us winning in 2019 and then COVID and Ukraine, logically speaking, those things should have changed. I think it's changed some rhetoric around science and technology. I think, you see a few more MPs saying that it should be important, but at the core of it, it remains a fifth order issue at the centre of power. It's not agreed that the Prime Minister is actually going to have priorities, and it's in the sense of you have task forces, you wake up every week, you're smashing things through your to-do list, and everyone in the system knows the PM really cares about this. The people who sit next to the PM all day really care about this. They're on the phone to us. We've got to report back every week. We've got to show progress. People are getting fired. The whole, again, what I said before about priorities, right? Whitehall has an extremely good sense of, does the PM's office have any priorities, or is it just a farce and they've collapsed? And if they do have priorities, what are they? And actually, Whitehall is good at, in lots of ways, responding. Even if their response is, we're going to try and stop them having this priority, we're going to close it down, blah, blah, blah. They do know what is a priority, right? That does not exist at the moment, obviously. And I don't think it will exist in the next few years. But if we are going to climb out of our nightmare, I continue to argue that a central aspect of it will be the Prime Minister arriving and saying, science and technology is a top 3 issue for me, and it's embedded in everything. It's embedded in the economy, it's embedded in security, and it's embedded in how we actually grip and change how our institutions work. Government itself, how Number 10 itself works, how the rest of Whitehall works, and everything else. So across all of the 3 kind of pillars of the thing, foundations of government itself, the economy, productivity, and all of that, and then on the other hand, security and forces and police and blah, 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 all that. Technology is central to all 3 of these things. And I am going to be engaged with these issues every week for the next 10 years that you see me in this job. That's what needs to happen.
At the moment, it seems that when technology comes up against an ideological commitment from, I suppose, our governance class, technology loses. And one recent case study, I think, is SpaceX saying that they want to enter partnerships with governments to build spaceports across the world. We should be jumping at the chance because we have a great satellite sector. We'd be one of the best places in the world to work. But, must arrangement syndrome is going to overpower what could be an exciting possibility. I see no prospect of the government ringing up Elon and saying we'll do business with you.
No. Also, there's if you want to talk about spaceports, there's another fascinating story over the last 50 years, right? Which is, if you go back in time, great World War II movie is Barnes-Wallis and Colditz and the famous bouncing bombs, right? After World War II, Barnes-Wallis wants to build various new planes and to keep Britain at the frontier. And there's tragic stories about how basically Whitehall from the 60s shut down that whole way of thinking that Britain is actually going to produce frontier things. Now, in the 80s, a very interesting thing happened. In a classified program, people came up with an idea for how to do a space plane. Ken Clarke and Michael Heseltine coordinated with Whitehall to close it down and stop the classified program happening because they wanted to do a European project instead, rather than Britain actually doing something itself. Fast forward, the technical people involved with that went off and did a non-classified version of the project in the open world and built this thing. For 20 odd years, they interacted with Whitehall, tried to get funding, and tried to get support for it. Finally, the thing is blown up. Now, this is after core aspects of the technology, such as the heat exchanger and whatnot, were also explored by NASA and proved to actually work. So again, you have a very interesting thing, right? Brilliant British technical people. So look at also the overall context. Overall context is one of the most fundamental technical things that America and China are both looking at is hypersonics, hypersonic missiles and hypersonic space planes. DARPA has been trying to do a space plane repeatedly for decades, failed. We actually come up with some critical ideas, new ideas that you could use to do this, right? That neither America nor China has done. The idea of Britain doing that, though, I've sat in meetings in Whitehall discussing this, and it's like a sort of allergic reaction in Whitehall. And the fact that it actually works and it's such a big deal makes them even more panicky and even more determined to make sure that the project doesn't go ahead. So I think that is like a classic example of this cultural problem, right? The people deciding fundamental budgets in Whitehall and things like, can you build a spaceport here? Are you going to try and work with Elon? Are you going to try and do that? The people with the actual regulatory power and the budget power are extremely hostile to the fundamental concept of Britain trying to develop something like this itself. It is not seen as something that Britain should do. The Whitehall view since the 70s has been these kind of very, very big, very futuristic projects Britain is out. The same way Britain got out of the empire, Britain got out of these kind of projects. That's why we closed down the space project and Britain's space program in the 70s. And we might do some odds and sods with BAE, but fundamentally, British military aerospace is going to be based on whatever the Americans build. Right? That's been the mindset. So again, this sort of tragic situation. There's a lot of talent here. A lot of things that could actually be done, but the people responsible for the budgets and the power are actively hostile to developing that.
Captain, we've lost the transmission, but the drives are back online.
Wherever you are, Agent Cummings, thank you. Now, midshipman, set a course for the Andromeda system. I heard there are aliens there that don't know how to use tablecloths.